We put a lot of different things in Hamantaschen. Like now, suddenly I don't want to eat a raspberry one because that reminds me of like menstrual cycles. I don't want to eat an apricot one because that looks like a yeast infection. Like, I'm sorry.
Adela, you're ruining Hamantaschen.
They ruined Hamantaschen. They ruined it, and I'm just showing you it's been ruined. Anyway, my name is Adela Kochav.
And I'm Mariam Waba.
We are the Daughters of Diaspora.
And this is Americanish.
Welcome back to Americanish. This week we're talking about two things we're very passionate about: food and faith.
Last week was Purim, a Jewish holiday generally associated with Hamantaschen, a triangle-shaped cookie usually filled with fruit jams, among other things. Some people love the cookie, while others not so much. On Friday, March 3rd, I saw that Tablet magazine, in partnership with Juicy, published a story titled "Stop Trying to Make Hamantaschen Happen," insinuating throughout the article that the buttery, jammy cookies were just not that good. The foodie that I am, I quickly texted Adela asking her thoughts on Hamantaschen, and she was quick to respond that she likes them. We quickly jumped on an Instagram Live to discuss this vital question with our friends and followers. There, we found much division. People love them, while others thought they were more often than not very dry and sandy. Even amongst those who liked Hamantaschen, there were varying opinions on what the best filling is. Now, we do want to issue a disclaimer here. We both love Tablet magazine and Juicy. We both know amazing people who work there, and if you don't already, go check them out.
But I do have to say that the article did spark the great Hamantaschen debate of 2023 between me and Mariam and the Tab and Juicy editors. And we actually did an Instagram Live on this if you want to check it out. But, Tablet and Juicy's bad take on Hamantaschen wasn't the only bad take that I read. So there was an article from Hey Alma about why Hamantaschen are shaped like triangles, talking about how they're actually supposed to represent vaginas. Trigger warning here if you don't like talking about vaginas, because I'm about to get into it for a second. According to this article, the Israelites, before they became a monotheistic religion, were making fertility cakes for Ishtar, the goddess of fertility. Ishtar sounds a lot like Esther, so around that time, they would continue to make fertility cakes. At the same time, in Italy, triangular-shaped cookies were very popular at the time for people who were worshiping Ishtar or whatnot, which is weird because why are people worshiping Ishtar in Italy? I have no idea, but the article seems to find it plausible. So the rabbi said, if people are eating these foods anyway around this holiday, let's just read an explanation into it. Let's just say it's Haman's hat. But the article goes as far as to say that the triangular cookie is supposed to be a pocket of poppy seeds mounds to remind us of Ishtar and fertility. And that was very uncomfortable to me. And, whatever it is that you think, and it might as well be true, it may be possibly true that all of this started because of a fertility ritual for Ishtar, and Ishtar is Esther, and now we're making fertility cakes, and it's a feminist holiday, and because of feminism, we have to eat vaginas. Sure, that's cool, but that's not the tradition anymore. And no offense, but if we're giving these cookies to children and to people, I'd rather be told I'm eating the hat or the ear of Haman, the man who wanted to kill us, than to be like, you're eating a vagina and the poppy seeds are pubic hair. And that's kind of not my vibe. Ugh. Not that there's anything wrong with it. If that's something you enjoy, go for it. But I just feel it was like, where are we? They called it the her story of Hamantaschen. How about we don't do that? How about we don't do that? I don't know. I personally found it a little bit retroactive when we read modern societal values and modern agendas into traditions that we've had for generations.
Right. And clearly food is very much tied to our faith and religion and everybody's faith and religion, whether you know it and can sense it and acknowledge it or not. Like, everything is tied to food, the way we practice our faith, culture, religion, whatever it is. It's all tied back to food. So I can definitely see why it might be concerning for you when people try to attach their personal agendas or movements to something that has been practiced and explained to you in a way for so long. And as the week went on last week, Adele and I could not stop talking about Hamantaschen, and not just because we both love the cookies and are so passionate about this, but it eventually led to us having a much larger conversation about the relationship between food and who we are as people. What does food mean to Jews? What does food mean to Copts? What does food mean to any other cultural or religious group? And how do they use food as a way to practice their faith and religion? And that's kind of where I want us to start this week. And I want to share what our general relationship to food is and how it fits into our very faithful, very religious lives. Adela?
So Judaism has a very close relationship with food, and food is a very large part of Judaism. Usually when you talk to someone about how observant they are, you usually ask two things. Do you keep Shabbat, and are you kosher? And, Jews to an extent will fall somewhere on a spectrum. There's the most stringent and there's the most lenient and people who just don't do it at all. But kosher food plays a very large part of your life. If you have kosher friends or friends who are fully glatt kosher, chalav Yisrael, you know that even to, go out to dinner, they can't go out to all the restaurants. It has to be a kosher restaurant. Can you eat at your friends' houses? Can you not? What foods can you or can you not eat? Some people eat dairy out. Some people eat fish out. Some people don't eat anything out. So when it comes to Judaism and kosher plays a huge role in our everyday lives. Food plays a huge role in our everyday lives and the way we interact with the secular, non-religious world. And then, of course, there's the way that food plays into holidays. Every holiday has a sort of food that's associated with it, either a mandatory food or a customary food. And we'll definitely get into that more in the episode, but that's the general Jewish relationship to food is a very big one. What about, Coptic Christians? I know we've talked about, if you haven't checked out our episode on fasting, Mariam really breaks down Coptic fasting, but Copts, as I understand it, fast for like 2/3 of the year.
Yeah, it's a lot of fasting, and I want to get into it in a sec. But first, I really want to understate and underline how Jewish food has transcended Judaism in a lot of ways and entered mainstream culture and mainstream conversations. The way that I use the words babka and challah and rugula and hamantashen in my daily vocabulary, is not healthy for my arteries, but it really speaks to how much Jewish food has entered everywhere else, and it doesn't just stay within the community, and it is a great way for other people to learn about our cultures. It's a great way to, learn about Shabbat, is learning what challah is and why we eat it, and you dip it in the salt, and you eat it on Fridays, and like the act of making it is just so beautiful, and it's part of both the religion and the culture.
I was going to say, I love when you go to a restaurant and you just see challah French toast or challah avocado toast. And I'm like, that's ours. That's ours. Like I saw,
exactly.
There's a place that has challah eggs Benedict. And I'm like, okay, I'll take it. Like, let's do it. Challah eggs Benedict. Don't you know?
Right. Bagels
yeah,
even.
Bagels. Jews control the world. Of course we control the food scene of New York.
That's right. Okay, back to Copts. So somebody did the math, and Copts are, or at least good Copts, are supposed to fast 210 days of the 365, which is, I can't do math for my life, but a little over 2/3 of the year. Is it a little over? No, it's a little under 2/3 of the year. My God.
Yeah. Neither of us are mathematicians. Yeah. It's cool.
Yeah, no STEM majors here. Anyways, so fasting is a big part of the Coptic identity, the Coptic culture, and it's a big part of our everyday lives because you're constantly thinking, oh crap, am I supposed to be fasting? And 2 out of 3 times the answer is yes. And the logical question or the logical place to go after, putting that out there in that we fast a little less than 2/3 of the year is like, why? Like, why? What does fasting do for you as a person of faith, as a Copt? And the answer is quite simple, yet, of course, complicated, in that food is one of the biggest ways that we are tempted. Gluttony is obviously a sin. So food is one of your earthly desires, your earthly needs. You obviously need food and fuel to go about your day, to wake up, to walk, to run, to do your exercises. So we look at food as a temptation first, and 2, as a way to connect to God. Obviously, Jesus fasted for 40 days. Moses fasted. There's all these biblical characters that we know that fasted as a way to achieve almost like a transcendent state and kind of blur out the world, blur out the material world in hope of a connection to this higher being. I'll give you one example on Easter. So on Easter Eve or Holy Saturday, the Coptic Church starts their Easter Vigil, which is also known as the Great Vigil, and it lasts until the dawn of Easter. most people at this time are already fasting, therefore meaning they are not doing any animal products, including fish and honey for this fast because it's a tier 2 fast. I'll get to that in a sec. But they abstain also from food and drink for almost 24 hours on Good Friday and Holy Saturday. And they break their fast at the end of that Mass. And this Easter Eve ceremony includes a symbolic reenactment of Christ's ascension, also called the resurrection play. And you'll see, if you go to a Coptic Easter service, which is like 8-9 hours, you'll see the church reenact in its liturgy, in its Mass, kind of the burial of Jesus and then the resurrection on Easter. And that is followed by the breaking of the fast, both from your vegan diet, but also from your literal fast, and that you haven't had food or water for the last 24 hours. All that being said, food is a very, very big part of Coptic culture and Coptic identity. And I want to get a little bit later on into like what are Coptic foods. But if I had to kind of sum it up, it's what I call poor food. And you'll find this in a lot of minority communities and a lot of ethno-religious communities, in that they are doing what they can to make food out of nothing. So you'll find a lot of obviously vegetarian food, vegan food, a lot of beans, a lot of things that don't cost very much, breads like flour, water, and yeast, sugar, because it's what our ancestors have done to survive for so long, being excluded from a lot of things, being on the outside on a lot of things. And obviously that changes once you have a diaspora. Things change and your poor food becomes not so poor food, and the idea or the concept of poor food changes. I remember the first time we went to a grocery store, one of the couple times we went to a grocery store here in the US, my mom was really surprised at the price of eggplants, because she grew up on a farm, and like in Egypt, or at least at the time we were growing up, like vegetables were the thing you eat if you were poor because they were very cheap. It's also what you could grow on your own if you couldn't even afford to buy it. And I remember she saw eggplants and like they were more expensive than like chicken per pound or something, and she was so confused as to why vegetables were more expensive. And I just remember it being like a really distinct memory in my head, because for her everything was flipped upside down. The poor food was no longer the poor food, and an eggplant was a luxury, and now meat and things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to afford are the things that you can afford. So that's just a weird anecdote. I don't know why it came to my head. I do want to switch gears a little bit to talk more about Jewish food. So last Christmas, I ended up ordering Chinese food, and I knew what the relationship between Chinese food and Jews on Christmas was, but I'd love for you to break it down for me.
We've all seen the meme that's like a note written like, "Dear Jewish people, I don't know why your God insists you eat Chinese food on Christmas, but our community thanks you." And it's like the ongoing joke, Jews and Chinese food on Christmas, Jews with Chinese food Christmas. And really it's a partnership of diaspora and a partnership of necessity, because the U.S. is a majority Christian country, and even if it's not observing Christianity, everyone takes off for Christmas. Everything's closed on Christmas. So if you were Jewish and for you Christmas was just a Tuesday and you wanted to go out to eat somewhere or order in from somewhere, the only thing open were Chinese restaurants. So it kind of became this like unspoken bond where it's like you're almost like outing each other, like, "Hey, you guys aren't taking off today?" No. Like, "Oh, you guys want to eat from a restaurant and not at your house today?" Yeah. Jews and Chinese people, there we go. Jews and Chinese food, unlikely partnership. And I love that you're telling me that you ordered Chinese food this past Christmas, because now it's not just Jewish Chinese, now it's Jewish Chinese Coptic. And look at this unity. Look at this "we don't celebrate on this day" crew.
That's right, yeah. And I think it's a really beautiful Americanish moment, and I call it Chinese Christmas, even though it's definitely not Chinese Christmas because it's anything but. But I just think it's really beautiful, like even just logging on DoorDash on Christmas and like being hungry because I don't celebrate Christmas on the 25th, being Coptic, and all you find is just all the Asian restaurants open, ready to serve. Like it's a beautiful mutual understanding of like, okay, we need to eat. No other restaurant will be open because everybody's celebrating this holiday, but we will stay open for you guys, and thank you for ordering from us. And I just think that's really, really beautiful. But obviously it isn't mandatory to eat Chinese food on Christmas as a Jew, but I do know that there are holidays, including Passover and Rosh Hashanah, where there are some mandatory foods. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Like you said, while it's not mandated to eat Chinese food on Christmas, we do have those mandatories. So if you take certain holidays like Passover or Rosh Hashanah, they have something called a seder, which means a process. And all of these are from the Torah, where there's certain foods that represent certain things that you must eat. So for example, on Passover, you must eat matzah. Otherwise, you can't say that you fulfilled your obligation of celebrating Passover. And there's a lot of foods on the Passover Seder. There's, again, different symbolism attached to it. But my favorite one is celery dipped into salt water, right? Because it's supposed to represent the tears that we cried. And this is something that we tell kids from their earliest ages. So like, during the Passover Seder, we look at the kids and we're like, and why do we eat celery with salt water? And all the kids together go, to represent the tears that we cried. And it's like, yes. And if that's the most Jewish moment ever. If we were ever going to connect some symbolism to a Jewish food, it's going to be celery with salt water for the tears that we cried. And it's very fun to me. So that's like a mandatory food. And then another mandatory food would be like on Rosh Hashanah. Again, there's a ton of different foods that symbolize things, but my favorite is we have to eat either the tongue of a cow, the head of a cow, the head of a fish eyeballs, just part of the head of an animal to represent that we're starting the year as a head and not as the tail. And it's, again, the symbolism, but it's something that you must do. You must have these symbolic foods as opposed to, for example, the customary foods. So we've talked about Hanukkah, and on Hanukkah we eat latkes and donuts, and both of those are oily foods, and the oily food represents the oil of the menorah, but that's not actually part of the holiday. It's a custom we've attached to the holiday. Same thing when it comes to Purim with Hamantashen. It's not really part of the holiday. It's something, a tradition, a custom we've attached to it. So if you don't have a donut on Hanukkah, or if you don't have a Hamantashen on Purim, those aren't really the commandments that you have to do to fulfill that holiday. So I shouldn't be so mad about the Hey Alma situation, about the vulva Hamantashen, because it's technically not a mandatory food. There are a lot of people that add things to their Seder plates, or they change up their Rosh Hashanah Seder or their Passover Seder in line with social values. And that I think is a little bit... that's a little bit more egregious, because at that point you're taking something that's mandatory and changing it, as opposed to adding an explanation or adding a custom to a customary holiday. So those are the two, right? You've got the mandatories and you've got the customs, and Jewish people love their food and Jewish people love their holidays. So that's how we break it down there.
Right. And I'm sure I would love to know from any of our listeners, like, think about anything that you do for a holiday, whether it's mandatory or customary, and think about how, if and when anybody changes within your community or outside of it, like changes any aspect of it, like how would you feel? Some things I'd be a lot more comfortable with than others. So Adela, I know you're trying to be very reasonable, and I don't think you should dismiss your anger towards this, like, changing of the narrative, because it's very real. Like, I can't imagine somebody coming into the Coptic church and being like, you know what? Instead of 210 days, we're only fasting 10 this year. Like, that would piss me off, no matter how much I don't particularly enjoy fasting, and that it's a very big inconvenience to my life. But it means a lot, and, like, the fact that it isn't inconvenience is part of it. Like, you are to be inconvenienced because you are trying to connect to God. Last thing I'll say on this is every Jewish holiday seems to be like, they tried to kill us, they failed, now let's eat. And that's kind of like, it doesn't surprise me that, dipping celery into salt water to represent the tears is a tradition. Yeah. There was actually, a couple years ago, I spent Hanukkah with a couple different rabbis and Shabbats, whatnot, and that was his toast for the dinners. Like, they tried to kill us 2,000 years ago, they failed, now let's drink. And that's beautiful. Like, that's all I need. Give me the food, give me the drinks, and let's party away the sorrows and pains that our people have experienced.
That's actually how I explained it. Like, again, it was just Purim last week, and whenever I was like walking around in New York, or like, for my doorman, because I got him some Hamantashen, and he's like, what is this? And I'm like, oh, it's like a Jewish holiday. We got these triangle cookies. He's like, what is it? I'm like, the hat of the man that tried to kill us. He's like, I need some more context here. And I was like, well, very long story short, Jews were in Persia. They tried to kill us. There was an evil man. Through the diplomacy of one of our heroines, they changed it up, and then he was killed, and we were made second in command to the king, and now we have cookies shaped like apparently vaginas. See? No, we don't. We don't have cookies shaped like vaginas. Anyway,
it doesn't even like the story is way less interesting if that's shaped like vaginas. I would much rather eat a cookie after the ear of an evil guy in
and
the
you know
story.
what?
That's
Like,
just way
they
cooler.
were talking about like poppy seed, but like we put a lot of different things in Hamantaschen. Like now suddenly I don't want to eat a raspberry one because that reminds me of like menstrual cycles. I don't want to eat an apricot one because that looks like a yeast infection. Like, like I'm sorry,
Adela,
trigger warning.
you're
I'm
ruining
ruining Hamantaschen.
Hamantaschen.
They ruined Hamantaschen. They ruined it, and I'm just showing you it's been ruined. Anyway, that's a very unkosher topic.
Okay. Well, speaking, I don't know how to transition here, but speaking of traditions and customary and kind of, mandatory foods, whenever I'm eating out with Jewish friends, including you, I always ask the question, like, do you eat kosher? Because you always want to be respectful of, are we going to a restaurant that has food for everybody that's going? So that's kind of like a basic question I ask, and I have a general idea of what kosher means, but I would love
For everyone listening, kosher is very complicated. And like I said, people keep it at different levels. So right now I'm going to explain the most strict form of kosher, which is what we should all aspire to be. But, not everyone's quite there. I personally am not quite there. But when it comes to kosher, there's a certain kind of animal that isn't kosher. And then there's animals that could be kosher if they're slaughtered and prepared in the correct way. So for example, when it comes to meat, if you have split hooves and chew your cud, like a cow, for example, then you're a kosher animal. An animal that doesn't have that would inherently not be a kosher animal. So a pig, for example, will never be kosher. A cow could be kosher, but it's not necessarily kosher unless it's slaughtered in a kosher way. When it comes to poultry, for some reason, instead of giving us parameters around what makes poultry kosher or unkosher, the Torah instead gives us a list of 24 birds that we cannot eat. I actually don't even know which ones are on that list, but chicken and turkey are good, so I don't have to really worry about, thank God. And then again, it comes with a kosher slaughter and preparation in order for that to be kosher. And then when it comes to fish, you have to have scales and you have to have fins. So a swordfish would not be kosher, shark would not be kosher, turtles are not fish, but they're sea animals, but not kosher. Dolphins, not kosher. Those are also mammals, not really fish. Definitely don't have split hooves, so that's a non-kosher animal. And again, then whatever is like a fish with scales and fins, so think tuna, salmon, snapper, sole, all of those don't actually even have a kosher slaughter, so which is very interesting to think of. But so that's how the meats are, and then I'll explain the kosher process in a second. The way that the kosher process is the animal has to feel the least pain. So kosher slaughter usually goes along with cutting the major artery. That way the animal doesn't feel pain and it will just bleed out instantly and die instantly. And after it's been kosher slaughtered, then you have to get rid of all the nerves, and you also have to get rid of all of the blood. And to do that, the meat is salted. That's why kosher meat is usually pre-salted, quote unquote. And when you're preparing kosher meat, you should be cognizant of that and season it a little bit less. On top of that, an animal, doesn't matter what kind of animal, can't be diseased. If it's diseased, then it becomes unkosher. And a lot of people are like, well, why does this exist? And I guess back in the day, if you had, let's say, for example, a sick sheep, then maybe you'd say, okay, this sheep is not going to be producing, it's not going to mate, it's not going to give us milk, so how about we just kill it and eat it? And now we know that that's a very good way to get diseases. So it's kind of like this, the Torah understood that if you eat a diseased animal, you might yourself be diseased, so it outlawed that. So once you've checked an animal falls within kosher categories, then you have to check whether or not it's diseased, then it has to be slaughtered in the kosher way, and then it has to be salted and all the nerves must be removed. At that point, you can say that you've had kosher meat, which is why it's so expensive, because it's a much longer process. It's not like you just have like one of those like places that just like, have mass produced meat, because you have to really check each individual animal. Now dairy is a little bit less complicated. So when it comes to dairy, actually, weirdly enough, in the US, the FDA regulates milk so much that the OU, which is the rabbinate that certifies the strict level of kosher, decided that the checks were enough to certify it as kosher. So it doesn't need any additional kosher certification. But if you do want it, that's an additional step called Chalav Yisrael. But other than that, most milks are FDA approved, which means that they're kosher. And then when it comes to cheese, there's something called retin, which is either oils that can be derived from non-animal sources or from animal sources. And most cheeses will use it from animal sources, which is what makes it non-kosher. And that's why most cheeses are deemed to be non-kosher unless they're specifically known to be made with non-animal oils. On top of that, once you have, okay, what's kosher and what's not kosher, you can't mix meat and dairy. You cannot mix them. If you eat meat, you have to wait 6 hours until you can eat dairy. If you eat dairy, though, you can eat meat pretty much right away. And fish is considered neutral. You can have fish with dairy. You can have fish with meat. You're totally fine if you're eating fish. It's considered a non-dairy and a non-meat. So, sorry. So for any fish out there that you're not sure what to identify as, don't worry. You can be whatever you want to be.
Wait, so you said, so can you explain that a little bit more? So you can have a piece of meat, but you have to wait 6 hours to have a piece of cheese, but you can have a piece of cheese and then have meat right after?
Yeah, it's very weird.
Why is that?
That's a really good question. I have no idea, but there are a couple of explanations. So some rabbis believe, or some commentaries believe, that meat takes longer to process in your stomach and for it to digest. So it's in your digestive system longer than a dairy would be. So because you don't want it to even mix in your system, you want to wait until it's been quote unquote digested. That's just one of the explanations. But the most important explanation that I've heard all the time is that it's a chok, which means that it's a rule that we don't have an explanation for. And the point of kosher, of course, like there's retroactively, we've seen a lot of health benefits. Of course, it's about practicing control and not gluttony. But the most important thing is that we keep kosher to honor God and to live according to the way of God. So even if we don't understand why, that's what we do. Again, like I said, I'm not quite there. I only wait 3 hours after meat and dairy. I have friends that don't wait at all. I have friends that wait the full 6. My sister waits the full 6. So, you could kind of find your in between. Make kosher work for you a little bit, but that's generally the idea of kosher. And then there's the idea of certification, because a lot of people ask about, well, what does it mean? Is it kosher certified? Because let's say, for example, you'll have a cookie and the cookie doesn't have a kosher certification and your, religious Jewish friend won't eat it. But you read the ingredients and it just says wheat, milk, flour, vanilla extract and vanilla flavors, let's say. The OU, the Orthodox Union, or whichever other kosher certification, they just certify that there's been, that this is a kosher product. So even though you're a kosher product, if you're not getting it certified by one of these organizations, which is relatively expensive, then your product won't say that it is kosher. So even though a product might technically be kosher in terms of whether or not its ingredients and its preparation are kosher, if it doesn't have the certification, someone who's Orthodox will not eat it. So sometimes you'll mean very well, and you'll buy a certain candy or a certain chocolate, you'll bring it to an Orthodox friend and they still won't be able to eat it, and you'll say, what do you mean, it's just dark chocolate? That's the reason why. It's all because of the certification.
Right. And that's really interesting because I'm sure there's other food restrictions, including halal, which we'll get to at the very end, and that some things may not, have the H on it, may not claim to be halal, but it very well could be halal. I want to go back to the meat and dairy thing real quick. Am I correct I'm going to tell you why I think I know why you guys Jews don't mix meat and dairy, and you could tell me if I'm wrong. So is there something in the Torah about not eating a calf and its son or daughter? Is that the reason why those two don't mix? So the words
of the Torah are that it would be an abomination to cook a baby in its mother's milk. So a calf in its mother's milk. It's just considered something heinous in the Torah, and that's the original reasoning behind it. Now, of course, we don't keep our cows together. Back in the day, you had your cows that gave dairy and then they gave birth to calves and those were your meat. And it makes perfect sense even when you had a town, the guy who had the cows and the guy who had the calves, odds are that they were bred together and those calves came from that cow. So it makes sense. But nowadays, we get our meat completely separate from where we get our dairy. And there's a lot of other dairies. So why can't I put goat cheese, for example, which comes from a goat, on lamb? Right? So now it's interspecies. It's well, that's obviously not its mother. They're different species. They obviously didn't come from the same farm. But in Judaism, we have this idea of building fences, right? So even though something might be technically okay or possibly okay, we build fences around it to make sure that we're okay. There's also the idea of marat ayin, which means the idea of doing something okay that doesn't fully seem okay. So for example, let's say you're cooking something with meat and you want to put almond milk in it. if someone passes by your home, by the way, this is actually in the Gemara, if someone passes by your home and they see you putting milk in what seems to be meat, they might think, oh, the rabbi's doing it, so I could do it too. They might get confused and they might actually do it too. So there's an idea that maybe you should put almonds next to it, or it should say almond milk on it, something like that. Or like, for example, let's say that you're very thirsty. You want to go into McDonald's just to get a soda, and you're an Orthodox rabbi. Can you go to McDonald's to get a soda? Obviously, they're not putting anything in your soda, right? The idea is that if an Orthodox rabbi is seen in a McDonald's, people might think it's okay to eat at a McDonald's, or people might think he's sinning, and then they'll think poor things about him. So it's like a don't do a okay thing that looks bad. Don't do something good that looks bad. It's a thing that we have in Spanish. No hagas algo bueno que parezca malo. Don't do something good that looks bad. So a lot of these are fences. Back in the day in Syria, there was no kosher certification. Back in the day, they used to just read the ingredients and be like, okay, that sounds fine. And then they would buy it and they would eat it. But nowadays we have a lot more checks and we are able to be a lot more careful. And again, this is just for the highest levels of kosher, which again, I one day aspire to be more kosher. Alas, I'm not quite there.
I just love the way religion is. It's just so freaking cool. Like, none of this makes any sense, but I'm so glad we get to do it. I'm so glad that we have these impulses and that we're able to check them as human beings, as societies, as part of communities, because we care about each other and we care about something higher than our earthly desires and our earthly needs. I want to take us back to the Coptic food, just to kind of contrast it to some of this kosher talk. So obviously, because of this huge fasting period in the Coptic calendar, a lot of Coptic food, it's kind of confusing to have a conversation about Coptic food because a lot of Coptic food is Egyptian food and is Arab food, and that kind of transcends borders and crosses into Levantine and other Arab countries that have the same food. But there are some there's some good evidence to that some of the foods that we know and love today actually have Coptic origins, including, drumroll please, falafel. So I know we're getting right in there. I can't believe falafel is such a taboo topic to talk about. But it turns out everybody claims falafel. Everybody and their mom thinks their country invented it, and their grandpa was the one that soaked the chickpeas, and the other grandpa was the one that grew the herbs and ground the spices, whatnot. But it turns out one of the explanations, and this is definitely not the only explanation, is that falafel is a Coptic food and a Coptic word. This possible theory was posed by a scholar who does falafel research. What a cool job he has. He posed that the dish was actually first created in Egypt by Coptic Christians about 1,000 years ago, who ate it as a meat substitute during one of our many, many fasts. The Coptic language at the time, which was way more popular than it is now and was a spoken language for centuries and decades, suggests that the Coptic origin notes or letters fa, la, fil, meaning of many beans, is actually the root of the Coptic word falafel. Obviously, this gets really complicated really fast. First kind of nail in this system that poses that falafel is a Coptic word and a Coptic food is that the word falafel in Arabic doesn't actually mean anything. In Egyptian Arabic isn't actually falafel. So the food is the same. So falafel is used around the Arab world to mean a ball of fried dough, usually made of chickpeas, spices, and herbs. You deep fry it and it's golden, and you put it in pita and you have a great sandwich. But the comparison for it in Egyptian Arabic is actually ta'amiyya, and it's the same food essentially with a few key differences. First, it's not a ball, it's much flatter and crispier. And two, regular falafel in the Levantine countries is made out of soaked chickpeas, while in Egypt it's made out of soaked fava beans. So there's obviously some discrepancies in this theory, but I like it and it fits my narrative, so I'm going to go with it, and I'm going to take the win for the Coptic team.
I love your explanation.
So,
I love it.
Yeah, it is what it is. I'm taking the win.
It reminds me a lot of... go ahead. Sorry.
No, please, go ahead.
It reminds me a lot of My Big Fat Greek Wedding. I don't know if you've seen the movie, but there's a part where the older Greek father is saying how every word comes from Greek, and the smart ass daughter is like, okay, well, what about kimono? which is obviously Japanese. And the father goes, kimono comes from kimona, which means winter, and kimono is a robe. What do you wear when you're cold? In the winter, you wear a robe. Kimono, kimona, there you go. And it's like, there it is. Falafel of the beans, of the many beans.
Every episode, we're going to do this thing where we just pick a random word, and I'm going to find a way to make it Coptic, and it's going to be completely made up every time, and I'm going to love it. Everybody, like, claims falafel. Like, everybody. Israelis, Egyptians, Palestinians, Lebanese, everybody in the
Greeks are like,
falafel.
it's ours, and everyone's like, go home.
Yeah. You have the euro, bro. Go home. Another Coptic food, which we've actually talked about in this podcast extensively, is the smelly fish, fasikh. So there's this holiday in the Egyptian calendar called Shem el-Nasim, which translates to the smelling of the flowers. And it stems from an ancient Egyptian holiday meant to celebrate and mark the spring solstice and the beginning of kind of the forming season, as it were. And obviously ancient Egyptians, including the Copts, kind of took it and ran with it, and it's still now a holiday that's celebrated by Copts and non-Copts all over Egypt. And it's, it usually happens sometime during the spring, like at the start of the spring. It's usually, honestly, like the day right after Easter, if I'm not mistaken. It's usually one of the most, one of the first, like, nice days of the year, like, nice weather, and you go outside, you spend the day with family, usually in a garden or in a park somewhere, and you eat this smelly fish called fasikh. And to make fasikh, trigger warning, this episode's been full of trigger warnings. You take a fish, you put abundant amounts of salt on it, you put it in like a metal canister, and you bury it in the scorching Egyptian desert for like 6 months, even more at times, and then you unbox it. Obviously, people don't do this. There's skilled craftsmen in doing this, and you buy it from them. And you take it out of the desert once it's done, and the salt kind of has made it all weird and tender, and you're supposed to eat it outside, because if you eat it inside, your home will stink for days. But that food, too, dates back to ancient Egyptian times and Coptic, and the Coptic tradition. And you'll find that a lot of the Coptic tradition or the Coptic foods is it's the Coptic people served as intermediaries between ancient Egypt and modern Egypt, and that they kept a lot of the ancient Egyptian culture and celebrations and foods alive and transitioned them to now, modern Egypt. And I think it's really cool that we keep a lot of these things alive, and my community, my people served as the mediators, the people who kept these things that would have otherwise died a very long time ago.
First off, when it comes to Shem el-Nasim and the smelly fish, do you guys have like a certain part of the desert that you use for this? Like, is it you just like you can't walk there because like there's buried fish everywhere? Like, how does it work? Like, do you guys rope it off like buried fish, like open when hot? Like,
that's hilarious. I don't know. I don't think so. I think so there's certain families that are known for, being like 100th generation fasikh makers, and people have their fasikh guy, like a freaking drug dealer. Like, you go to this guy to get your stinky fish. So I think they have, probably bought land in the desert somewhere so that their family can continue this tradition and continue this, occupation and pass it down to their kids and grandkids and so forth. Maybe let's go to Egypt. Let's find out. Let's find out if there's just fish in the desert.
I mean, Fish in the Desert. That'd be a really cool name for a memoir, Fish in the Desert. But that actually takes me to my next question. So Coptic Egyptians, for our followers who know, but our followers who don't know, are Christians in Egypt. And Egypt, of course, eats halal. So we talked about the fasting, we talked about some Coptic foods, but how did halal play into your upbringing as a Coptic Christian?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And it's one I get often. A lot of Copts who live in Egypt, the majority of Copts currently live in Egypt, will eat halal because the country eats halal. Like, the world eats halal the same way that it's kind of difficult to eat kosher or halal here. It's kind of difficult to not eat halal in a Muslim country. So the word halal, let me just kind of take us back one step. The word halal is an Arabic word that means lawful or permitted in relation to food, but it also applies to a lot of other things like cosmetics, nail polish, other personal care products. So what kinds of things aren't halal? Pork, bacon, ham, of course, are kind of the things that people know off the top of their head. Any meat that comes from a pig, because a pig is considered a dirty animal because it eats trash. Obviously, any meat products that come from pigs, and any meat products that come from an animal that was not slaughtered in a halal way. And that includes, well, I kind of want to actually, trigger warning again, go through what it means to slaughter an animal in a halal way, because it's very similar to the way that you were describing about kosher. Let me just see. So in order to slaughter an animal in line with the Islamic faith, a cut needs to be made through the windpipe, chordaroid artery, and the jugular vein. The animal needs to be healthy, cannot be disabled or harmed in any way. And once that cut has been made across the major arteries, I assume it's because it's also intended to be the least painful way for the animal to die. All blood needs to be drained from the animal. So very, very similar to kosher. In addition to all of this, while this is happening, including the butchering, the butcher is reciting a dedication known as the Shahada or Tazmiyah. To answer your question, a lot of Copts and a lot of minorities across the Arab world, including Egypt, will eat halal because it's what's happening around them. In fact, my parents have always eaten halal, and when we moved to the U.S., they continue to eat halal. My sisters and I don't, because we like ribs too much. But even till this day, my parents eat halal. They won't, eat pork or come near a pig, because in their head, they grew up with their Muslim neighbors expressing very openly that it's a dirty animal, so they refuse to eat it. It's very fascinating how it's not, written in our theology or Bible or anything like that, but we still maintain it because it's part of our culture. And I would even say it's very Egyptian-ish to keep things that don't really belong to you, even though they don't apply to you, you still keep them.
So it's very interesting that you're talking about how halal is somewhat similar to kosher. I love that your parents still keep halal now, because again, it's kind of like those traditions of the diaspora that seep into your culture, or traditions of your culture that you keep in the diaspora. And I really love that. And I think one of my favorite halal kosher interactions was when I went to NYU, the kosher cafeteria was always full of people who ate halal, because all food that's kosher is more stringent than halal. So everything that's kosher is halal, but not everything that's halal is kosher. So people who only ate halal felt very comfortable at the kosher cafeteria because they knew that they could eat all of those foods. So it was a very cool moment. It was kind of like that, Chinese, Christmas, Jewish situation where it's we're both here because we have this understanding of something it is we have in common. Instead of it being a day we have in common where we're going on about business as usual, we have these restrictions we have in common, and we're sharing in the keeping of our traditions.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings us to our last topic of today, which is diaspora foods, if we can even call it that. What does it mean to be a Jew living in the diaspora? And what does it mean to be a Copt living in the diaspora and having to observe all these food laws, I would call them, trying to keep as much as you can, but also trying to assimilate and adapt to this new world. What is diaspora food, or what words come to mind when I start to talk about being a Jew in the diaspora trying to maintain kosher?
There's a lot of ways, but just in terms of an Americanish understanding of diaspora food is when people bring challah, and it's sourdough challah, or it's pretzel bun challah, and it's all of those fulfill the obligation of challah, but it's this very Americanish take on a Jewish tradition where it's here we happen to love sourdough, great, let's make sourdough challah, and that's completely kosher and you're allowed to do it. And like I was saying before, when people do challah French toast or challah eggs Benedict or challah avocado toast, it kind of takes a Jewish thing and makes it more modern. And I think that's a really a product of the diaspora. It's the equivalent of ramen burgers. I don't think anyone in countries that traditionally eat ramen were eating ramen burgers, but that is the diaspora, and that's where we're living in right now. But my favorite interaction, and I talk about this all the time, and Passover is coming up, so I'm really happy it's coming up, is as a Sephardic Jew, we eat grains on Passover, and that includes corn. Mm-hmm. So as a Sephardic Mexican Jew, we eat tortillas. So for me, Passover is directly associated with Mexican food. For me, Passover is a week's worth of tacos, enchiladas, chilaquiles, empanadas, all of these hadas, if we want to call them that, we have all these tortilla-based foods, and that's just how my community adapted to the fact it was in Mexico. We were a Sephardic community in the Mexican diaspora, or in the diaspora in Mexico. So we adapted our Passover into a Mexican Sephardic Passover, and that is fully a product of the diaspora. What about you?
Yeah. It's so interesting when these two worlds or two or more worlds clash. So obviously I try to do as much of the Coptic fast as I can, and that means I end up eating a lot of Asian food, like tofu-based foods, because it tends to be vegan. There's this great restaurant by me that I will forever gatekeep that does exclusively vegan, exclusively like Asian cuisine, and I end up eating so much of it because I am fasting, and that's, you know, the most accessible vegan options that I have if I'm not cooking. And I often think about how, like, my Coptic ancestors would just be very confused by me eating, you know, like a bao bun or, I don't know, like kung pao tofu for dinner as you know, as a way to keep my fast. There's also this restaurant called Shalom Japan.
So I haven't been, but I've heard so much about it.
We should check it out. I've heard really good things. So obviously Shalom Japan. So they do like kosher Japanese food, kosher sushi, which I think sushi is inherently vegan, right?
It depends. So there's
kosher.
So actually, it's funny that you say that, because I didn't talk about this earlier, but there's a lot of people that will eat sushi out, because if you're just having like rice, you know, seaweed, and then they're just putting vegetables in it, let's say, then there's no danger for non-kosher. The only danger would be cross-contamination. So if you ask them to change the knives, to change the cutting boards, to change the gloves, then you're eating a cold food, so there's no transferring of non-kosher. So sushi is, if people eat out, usually the first thing they'll eat out will be sushi. So I have a lot of friends that don't eat fish out, they don't eat pastas out, they don't eat dairy out, but they do eat sushi out. So it's interesting that you bring that up, but yes. But yeah, Shalom Japan I've been hearing really rave reviews about. So we're going to go. We're going to do a review.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, oh my God, let's just turn this show into food review. That would make all my dreams come true. Well, this was just kind of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this conversation about the relationship of food to religion and faith, and what food means to us personally and in our cultures. We hope to do more of this. Please reach out to us and let us know, like, what does food mean to you personally in your faith, in your culture, in your community, and how you kind of use it as a way to connect, because we know we certainly do.
Thank you so much, guys. We'll see you next week.